Chuck, great to see you again, and thanks for being on the program. How would you say strong, secure, engaged has impacted defense procurement in Canada, if at all? And could you describe a few lessons that have been learned from its implementation, and how could it inform the decision-making process going further?
So I think there's certainly some of the commentary suggests that there's some misunderstanding of what the defense policy is and what SSE was. So SSE was intended to provide the government's assessments of the nation's defense needs and to lay out its plans for keeping the associated CAF capabilities current and capable of doing the mission. And that included providing cost estimates for the investments that were going to be required and allocating the funds to make those investments. The fact that those cost estimates go up from time to time has suggested to some people that the policy was underfunded from the outset and was therefore some sort of a failure or less than excellent product. I don't agree with that. Cost estimates are point-in-time estimates. They're just that, they're estimates. And they are all based on certain assumptions. And those assumptions will change, the estimates will change as work is done to fill in the unknowns and to modify and drive down risks. And as basic commodity and labor prices and everything else change over time, usually upwards, of course. So governments in that context have to decide periodically, do I constrain what I'm asking the project to deliver to the budget, to some sort of an envelope, or do I say I need this level of capability and I'll have to fund it to that level? And that's no different from, say, if I were building a home and I hadn't yet bought the lot and I hadn't yet finalized the design, and you go through stages of understanding what the cost drivers are going to be, and you go through the process of deciding how much money you're going to put into getting that home built the way you want, or what compromises you're going to have to make in order to keep within what you think you can afford or want to spend. So it's no different in government going through decisions around defense procurements in these complex programs. And I point out last year's inquiry, certainly of interest to those of us here in Ottawa, into the Ottawa LRT light rail system political boondoggle, the previous council's management of that implementation of that project. And one of the things that the inquiry clearly pointed out was the folly of turning initial estimates into a politically sacrosanct budget cap. They've had to make some pretty serious trade-offs in order to keep within that politically mandated cap. And that caused all kinds of problems as they tried to bring the system online. So in that context, I think SSC was actually successful, and it gave DND and the other government departments involved in executing the various programs involved the marching orders. Said, you're going, take the hill, this is, and everybody's going to pull in that direction. And that really smoothed out the process within government of getting all the players to move in the same direction at the same time and deliver results. It was a perfect, and the whole process never perfect, but without the policy, D&D faces enormous obstacles in trying to move program forward and get decisions from government. What happens after a few years is that policy direction gets stale dated. So this is why the SSE update is going to be important, because the DND will get a renewed, and all the other departments will get a renewed mandate to move to the next bound. I think that's really important. Where I will agree with the critics of SSE is that it largely failed to support its aspirations for, again, improving defense procurement. Every government that's ever come into power has promised to improve defense procurement, but it didn't back any of those aspirations up with concrete measures that would have actually accomplished that. There were some small successes. So DND did get a bump up in its own procurement authorities or contracting authorities up to $5 million. So that cleared a bunch of clag out of the interdepartmental schmozzle around procurement. But inflation has been eating away over the last few years over the value of that. I also think that D&D was successful. They got additional funding to and further strengthen their own in-house capabilities. Not so sure about other departments having been that successful either. There was no visible sign, though. There's been no visible sign since 2017 when SSE came out of any improvement in the departmental machinery of government for moving those big procurement projects forward. I haven't seen anything beyond what had already been delivered under the Harper government's defense procurement strategy, which the Trudeau government has continued with. So what lessons the government should draw from that or might draw from that, I don't know. Based on history, I have fairly low expectations. But SSC, I look to SSC to perhaps contain some further adjustments to process, probably more peripherally around the edges, but some is better than none. However, absent something more fundamental, and maybe we can talk about that a little later in the discussion. I don't see much scope for SSC to make really radical improvements in the defense procurement business. The government came into power with a certain view of the world, and that was reflected in SSC. So we had seen the annexation of Crimea. We had seen Russia becoming much more aggressive in its neighborhood. China had been a little bit belligerent, but the government fundamentally didn't see China as a problem. It saw it more as an opportunity. And after SSC came out, sort of they had the rose-colored glasses ripped off their faces, like every other Western government, like Germany, like many other countries. When the Russians invaded Ukraine, and earlier during the Two Michaels confrontation with China, that there's a fundamental rethink. Those were what we would call strategic shock events that forced countries and groups of countries to fundamentally rethink their foreign policy, their defense requirements, and so on. And those things have happened since the publication of SSE. So I would be expecting to see some pretty fundamental recasting of the government's perspective of the global environment in this update. And if that's not there, then the document is a joke. But I'm sure it will be there. Minister Freeland has always had a fairly robust view of the value of sort of the hard power capabilities of the nation. And she is still obviously influential in cabinet. I think Minister Joly is more in that direction than some other elements of the government may still be. I'm not sure where the Prime Minister is. My sense has always been that he's more comfortable in the soft power realm, but I think he's a pragmatist and he sees that the world is what it is, not what one might like it to be.
Now that we've talked a little bit about SSE, what are some of your thoughts, concerns, or questions regarding what's in the upcoming defense policy update? We've already discussed it a little bit, but perhaps you could elaborate more on what might be in there.
Sure. So the first thing I'm going to be looking for is whether the government has done any more comprehensive thinking about the international environment that I just spoke about, and more particularly about the government of Canada's international engagement strategies that it should be following. So, as I mentioned, that SSE, SSE did contain some foreign policy context, but it looked to be an afterthought. Minister Freeland had a piece, a letter or message at the front end of the document, along with Minister Sajjan. And she stood up in Parliament a couple of days before SSE was released and presented a fairly comprehensive, I would call landmark foreign policy speech in Parliament, which was very unusual. Unfortunately, it wasn't accompanied by a foreign policy statement of some kind, foreign policy document to align with SSE, but the messaging was consistent among them. But defense policy and foreign policy need to be integrated between them, and they also need to be integrated with other policies like international trade, international development, and so on, for you to have a comprehensive and coherent government strategy around how you're going to engage in the world. The only policy suite that I recall having seen over the years that nature was Paul Martin's in 2005, accompanied by a 2004 national security policy statement, which is the first and only national security policy that any Canadian government has ever produced. So that's the first thing I'll be looking for, is some sense that the government is thinking more broadly about how it approaches the world. Second thing I want to look for is whether the Ukraine war, China's increasing belligerence that we talked about, and the continuous pressure that the government has been receiving from its allies, particularly the NATO allies, see whether that has moved their yardstick, you move the needle for them in terms of their moving the country, getting the country closer towards the 2% GDP spending target. I'm not holding my breath, and I don't think they move very far, but they might move some. Third thing I'm looking for is a clear path towards accelerated acquisition of a new submarine fleet, because planning for the replacement of the aging Victoria class, which were used boats when we bought them, is very, very late to need. It was something I criticized SSC for when it came out. It's not having a plan. They had some midlife updates for the Victoria class mentioned in it, but there was no mention of planning of starting to plan for replacement, and that's when it should have started. So they're it's about 6 years late in getting the thing moving, but there have been signs that that's happening or starting to happen. And I'll expect to see some movement in that direction. So those are the three sort of big movers that I'm looking for in SSC. There will undoubtedly be a range of other things as well, but those are the three big kickers.
So you've described things you're expecting in the defense policy update, the essentials. I'm wondering if you might be able to provide insight into any specific procurement areas or projects that you think might or should receive increased focus and investment with the upcoming defense policy update.
So I've already mentioned the submarine replacement. I think that's the most urgent, and it's a big ticket item that needs to be moving. The government's also already signaled movement on Aurora replacement. There's a little bit of controversy about whether they should buy a Bombardier aircraft or a Boeing aircraft, but that project is already in progress clearly, and upgrade of NORAD. So, and finally, it's also remained solid in terms of the 15-ship Canadian Surface Combatant Fleet. So, alongside the F-35 program, which is in implementation now, those programs will collectively rebuild over time the CAF's most critical capabilities to fulfill one of the two big no-fail tasks for any Canadian government, and that is surveillance and defense of Canada's maritime and air approaches, which are also largely our U.S. neighbors' maritime and air approaches. So we got to get that right. We can never afford to let ourselves down in that area. And all of those modernizations are late to need. There's another no-fail task, which is the defense internally within Canadian territory. That requires defense capabilities, but not capabilities typically that have big ticket capital investments associated with them. Those are mostly people-driven, and we have a pretty good handle on those. So those two areas are kind of like the core area of business that we have to get right as a nation. Now, as a member of the Alliance, there's another area of business which is important, and that is the deterrence of Russian aggression along NATO's eastern flank. And that's not strictly speaking a no-fail task for Canada as a nation, but it is a NATO no-fail task. And as a member of NATO, founding member of NATO, we got to be there and be part of that solution. They've already started, the government has already started to move to fill in some capability gaps that the war in Ukraine has shone spotlights on in dark corners. So air defense and anti-armor capabilities, for example. And I expect that the update will need to contain some more in that area as well. So I think those are kind of the really important ones from my perspective. There will be a whole bunch of other things. The SSC was big on people, people issues and that sort of thing. And I expect the update will continue that trend. And there are certainly some cultural issues within the military, the people issues and all of that. So they'll be there too, but these are the ones that I'm most focused on.
Speaking of procurement, moving a bit away from SSC and defense policy update, obviously procurement is a bit of a belabored topic here in Canada. As a procurement guy, you're obviously aware that we often in our public discourse criticize procurement, and it seems we've been doing that for a very long time. Having said that, I'm wondering, to your knowledge, are there any specific measures that the government is trying to implement to streamline the procurement process or reduce some of the red tape and ensure the timely delivery of equipment and systems that the CAF needs?
Yeah, so there are a couple of perspectives I'd like to bring in on this. So first of all, I think the single most important underlying foundation of the defense procurement issues we see and the chronic state of rust out of key systems is the fact that there's been a long-term strategic imbalance between force structure and defense budget. Basically, we have too much force structure for the budget we're prepared to put into defense. And so too much of the money goes to personnel costs. So, military salaries and benefits and defense civilian salaries and benefits and family programs for military and all that sort of stuff. That's all critical. It's all important. But too much of the budget's going into that. So there's not enough left to progressively and continually recapitalize your equipment and to conduct the training, so the operation and maintenance budget, which allows you to train and keep stuff in good shape. So we need to be consistently spending, in my view, about 25% of the defense budget, whatever that defense budget is, on recapitalization. So that's R&D, test and evaluation, and procurement of equipment. We're not even able to consistently keep up to the NATO recommended floor of 20%. We're scraping along 18, 19, sometimes below that. Australia this year is planning to spend 24% on the recapitalization, and the US spends about 35%. So this imbalance, to me, explains why DND is constantly behind the technology curve and behind the operational effectiveness curve. And it operates its fleets a lot longer than anybody else does. And that creates all kinds of problems in terms of the effectiveness and rust out and the capabilities that the CAF at any given time can bring to any given table. So what we need to do is move ourselves to a state where we are working on long-term plans which keep capabilities current. So, for example, based on a 30 to 35-year planned life cycle for a fighter platform, noting that the CF-18s are now over, the first CF-18s were delivered over 40 years ago, and they're going to continue serving until they're about 50 years old. And all of our other systems are basically in the same boat. So there's a constant competition within DND to figure out which looming obsolescence is the most urgent. That's where the money goes, and everybody else has to wait. So we need to sustain a recapitalization spending level, I say about 25% over a long period of time to get through all, to clean up all of the backlog of problems. And that's regardless of whether we're spending 1% or 2% or 3% of GDP on defense. Pick your number. 25% goes to recapitalization, and then you divvy up the others between what you need for OM, and you structure the personnel force structure to what you can afford. If we could do that, if SSC update can do that, it would be the most important defense policy reform in this country since the unification of the armed forces, the integration and unification of the armed forces at the end of the 60s and early 70s. I'm not holding my breath to see that. So to go on to the second part of your question, I wasn't in D&D when SSC itself was drafted, so I don't know what the machinations went on behind the scenes. I was involved with CDA Institute and a number of folks in offering recommendations to the external panel advising the minister on the development of the policy. And I wrote some stuff that I know the panel members had seen in the lead up to that. It was pretty clear to me that there was some active discussion, very active discussion, I expect, among ministers. It was clear that Minister Freeland, as I said earlier, had some pretty activist views in terms of what the global security situation demanded. And I think that at the time, retired Lieutenant General Andy Leslie was in the government. He was government whip for a while, or the House Leader for a while, and he undoubtedly had some input. So there were views there, and they would have been sort of more activist views. Others, I think, probably at that time, including the Prime Minister, maybe less so, but they would have had a very lively debate, and that's good. That's what we want our governments to do. And I think in the end, it was the reality of Russia's belligerence that made SSC surprisingly ambitious compared to what the government seemed to have in mind when it came into power 2 years earlier in 2015. At that time, they hadn't, they still had a more positive view of China and other things, but they were assessing the situation as they saw it at the time. So, and I mentioned now, since then, we've had the strategic shock events, and the government's clearly aware that things are turning turtle globally, and we got to be part of the solution. If we're not part of the solution, we're part of the problem. And whether that will, as I said, whether that will translate into a full court press to get us to 2% of GDP or above in terms of defense spending, I doubt. But I kind of think that we'll see some change in the, some inflection in the trend lines, maybe a little bit faster, a little bit closer to getting us there instead of in 10 or 15 years. Maybe we get there in 5 to 10 years. I'm not sure. We'll see. It'll be interesting to watch.
Chuck, thanks once again for joining me. It's always a great pleasure having you on the podcast. Thanks so much for making the time, and we'll talk to you again soon. That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or you can subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks, and we hope you'll be joining us next week.